I'm Amanda Knox, and you're listening to Hard Knocks. Welcome to another episode of Musing with Amanda Knox, where Chris tells me something you guys have been thinking about, and then I think about it out loud for a while. What are we talking about today?
Well, I noticed the other day on X, you had posted a thread about the Lucy Letby case. This is relating to the podcast series Doubt, the case of Lucy Letby that we've produced with iHeartRadio. That's been coming out weekly on Tuesdays.
I've put out a few threads. Yeah. Which thread was this one?
I don't remember, but I noted that someone had responded by saying, "Don't listen to this woman. She's been, she's biased with a grievance against, the justice system. And therefore, anything she has to say about this case is tainted by her bias." And it got me thinking about, isn't that also the source of your expertise about how a wrongful conviction happens?
Yeah, I was just about to say, congratulations, Amanda. I have now been, granted expert status.
Yeah. And so I think the thing I'd love to kind of think out loud about today is, what's the relationship between bias and expertise? And how does that play into the criminal justice system and in regular life, but particularly the criminal justice system but also journalism in your case here? How does it affect juries? How does it affect expert witnesses, prosecutors, police, judges?
Yeah.
Do you inevitably develop a bias when you spend countless hours developing expertise? And what do we do about that if so?
Yeah, this is a great question, because it is true that it is these things tend to develop alongside each other unless there are countermeasures. So expertise, if you think about how an expert just comes into being, is anyone who has put in any kind of sustained and rigorous attention or engagement with a specific topic. So that could be a kid who knows everything there is to know about Pokemon cards, right? Like that kid, if you were to ask him about anything in the world related to Pokemon, he would be able to cite you stats and figures and be able to draw,
And if you ask him what's the best collectible card game, he's going to be biased.
He's going to, and right? Absolutely, because he's already, just by choice of becoming an expert in that thing, sort of made his stamp over why he might think that that is the best. Although it would be interesting to hear... I would be curious to hear different people who are super into different, for example, I'm a huge Harry Potter fan. I don't think that it is the best, just on a how things are written level. I don't think it's the best story ever, because there's a lot of just good versus evil, which I don't find as interesting. Especially when it comes to the ultimate showdown between Harry and Voldemort. I don't really find that all that interesting. And so even though I'm a huge, stupidly huge fan of Harry Potter, and I'm still we are going to the UK in a few weeks, and I am so excited, and I am going to visit every Harry Potter store in the UK. I can acknowledge that on a storytelling level, it's not the epitome of...
Well, something about it must be the best for you to be that big of a fan. Maybe it's the world building or
Sure, and it's also just the time of life that it came into my awareness. So I think that's a really good example of someone who if you were to have me over for a Harry Potter trivia night, I would destroy you. But does that mean that I'm such a huge fan and an expert that I can't acknowledge some of the fault lines within the series?
I mean, some people are better at this than others, right? And I think you happen to be a person who is on the better end of that spectrum. And I think this is in evidence with your stance on criminal justice issues as well. I mean, just to address that very topic, are you biased in favor of innocence when looking at a criminal case?
Okay, so
or not.
I love that you want to immediately defend my honor. We don't have to go there immediately. So I want to back up and first of all, explain the difference between expertise and bias. So expertise, it absolutely means that you have, either through experience or through training, arrived at a place where you are able to notice things about the world and about their interconnections that other people who have not received the same kind of experience and training might not notice or appreciate its value. Now, so that's expertise. The thing about expertise that makes it different from bias is that expertise is open to correction. So an expert who has an opinion about something based upon their expertise is still going to be able to reevaluate based upon new information, especially if that information is contradictory.
Well,
Bias,
a good expert, a
sure.
good clear
So
thinking.
I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there because the thing that you are telegraphing is that experts can be also biased. And that's where it gets really interesting in terms of how it relates to the real world. Just on a definitional level, bias is an often unconscious thing where your brain has been trained to recognize certain things and to derive conclusions based upon that pattern recognition. And the big difference between whether or not you're being driven by bias or expertise is if you are allowing the evidence to help you reevaluate your conclusion, or if your conclusion is set and you sort of like corkscrew your evidence in and ignore evidence that doesn't go with your conclusion. And this becomes the most dangerous, and I think this is how it relates to us as human beings, is that we are all experts in one degree or another of certain things, because we have, your dad, I would argue, is a football expert.
Sure.
He watches a whole lot of football. He knows a lot about football. He's played football. He's coached football. Football. Okay. He's an expert in football or golf, whatever. That's his thing.
Both. Yeah.
Both. Does that mean that he might view the world in a biased way because he views it through the lens of football or golf? Maybe. I don't know. I do know that if you are a police officer, for example, you have a lot of experience and expertise in law enforcement. That's your job. That's what you've been trained to do. You've studied it. You've lived it. You've worked it. And as a result of that, you can be considered an expert. You can also be considered biased if, in the practice of your expertise, you stop allowing yourself to be swayed by the evidence, and instead you use evidence to support whatever conclusions you have already derived based upon old habits of mind. And there's another way, by the way, that people can confuse expertise and bias. So, for instance, someone might say, they might say, okay, you're biased, like the person who approached me. You were wrongly convicted, therefore you are biased against any case where someone might be actually guilty. Okay, that's an interesting claim. And it is true that due to my particular experience and the rigorous amount of thought and effort to study this phenomenon, I have a very robust radar for criminal justice bullshit. And so my little radar goes off and is more subtle and nuanced than most people's radar, which means that I can provide insight Now, how has that been used in practice? Is it the case that I have supported people who were in their claims of innocence who were actually guilty? Yes, I have. So that would seem to be evidence that I am biased. But was I willing to admit I was wrong? Yes. So that would
Amanda
suggest...
is referring, of course, to the Jens Suring case, for which we did a big podcast series about arguing for his innocence, and then later came to believe that the evidence did not support an innocence claim. And Amanda wrote a long article for The Atlantic about that revelation and about the importance of publicly owning that revelation for the sake of the integrity of the innocence movement and her own credibility as a journalist. We can put a link to that article in the show notes for this.
Right. So in this case, this is a person who is claiming that my expertise can be dismissed away as bias merely because, and I think merely because they just don't like the conclusion. That's typically where that comes from.
I would point out here is that you get approached all the time, especially on social media, to advocate for this or that innocence claim.
Mm-hmm.
And your default stance is usually no comment.
Right.
You know?
I can't comment unless I know the facts of the case.
I mean, people want you to weigh in on the Karen Reed case, and it's like your answer is, I'm not commenting on that case because I have not studied it in depth enough to have an informed opinion. And that's a respectable position to take.
I think maybe people don't understand the number of times that basically, so just so everybody knows, basically any time there is ever a case that has risen to some kind of awareness in the media, people are sending me messages asking me to come on TV and comment about it. You do not see me doing that because of that. That's the sort of background information that you may not know about me, is that I am constantly asked to be commenting on cases, and the vast majority of the time I do not. In the same way, for instance, that a lot of people think that innocence projects are just taking on any case whatsoever and are claiming that anybody and everybody who approaches them is innocent, when in fact, what is really happening behind the scenes in innocence projects is they are carefully reviewing all of the cases that come their way, and they only take on the cases where they feel like they have not just a solid claim of innocence, but a solid path forward to prove that innocence and get that person out of prison. All of which are like levels of necessity that might, it might be the case where they believe the person is innocent. They feel like they could even prove their innocence, but there's no legal avenue forward.
And so they
might not take that case.
Yeah.
So that just for that. Another way that people mistake expertise and bias, though, is when they assume that an expert isn't biased simply because they are an expert.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a really interesting situation with the Lucy Letby case, because they brought in a neonatologist, the police brought in a neonatologist to review the, autopsies and all the information they could get on these babies and come up with his expert opinion about how these babies died. And just by virtue of him being a medical expert, it's considered that he is unbiased and that his opinion is objective and sound. And I think that is I think that is a mistake too, to just assume that just because someone is an expert that they are employing their expertise without any kind of bias. And the test for that is whether or not evidence can be brought to light that would change that expert's opinion or conclusions about the case. And I think the thing that's really interesting about the Lucy Letby case is that Dr. Dowie Evans has not been super consistent on his evaluation of these cases. Like, there's at least one case in which after the trial was over, he changed his opinion about how that baby was murdered. The one thing he did not change his opinion about, no matter what evidence was presented, was whether or not the babies were murdered. I think that's really interesting.
If they were murdered, yeah.
No, like, yeah, whether or not they were murdered, he was like, they were murdered. Now, how they were murdered, I may or may not change my mind, but they were murdered. That, I think me is...
The other notable thing about any expert witness that's worth looking at is how and when and how frequently are they employed, right? Like, is this a person who has routinely testified for prosecutors? Have they become a go-to prosecution expert? Or do they equally testify for defendants, right? Are they playing both sides? How often are there arguments they're making in a court of law, defending someone from a claim of harm versus affirming that someone committed harm?
And this is a similar thing that could be said about lawyers who are like, one of the things that a lot of people think is a good idea is for people who train to become prosecutors to spend time as defense attorneys, and people who are trained to be defense attorneys to spend time working as prosecutors, so that you can get an appreciation of how, like, you literally start to view reality in a certain way, given your expertise and given the sort of mission of your expertise. So if you're employed by a prosecutor's office, you're deciding whether or not to find criminal fault in another human being. And in some cases, you are incentivized to find fault and hold people criminally accountable because of political pressure, because of, like, you get...
it's also a paycheck for some people.
There's a paycheck for some people.
Yeah.
So, like, the more cases that you're able to prosecute and close, the better it is for you personally. And therefore, you start to see things in a certain light. And that's where incentives become a really interesting equation. For me, in this case, I didn't have to take on this case or talk about this case whatsoever. It's not like it's my job to defend Lucy Letby. It's not. And in fact, I'm actually taking a risk by doing so, because this is a very complicated case. And one thing is certain, there were babies that were dying at a rate that was unusual in this hospital. Something was going wrong. Now, one thing that could have been going wrong is that there was a serial killer nurse. That could have been the thing that was going on. But based upon my evaluation over time of the medical evidence and the statistical evidence, and even just thinking about probability and also examining how confident people felt about certain pieces of evidence, like I'm completely interested and stuck on how people were. I think that her handwritten notes, where they like cherry picked one phrase out of all of these notes that says, "I'm evil, I did this," is, without a doubt, her confession. Like, to me, that is evidence of confirmation bias, that you're just completely ignoring everything else she wrote, completely ignoring the context, completely ignoring the psychological explanation for those kinds of, things to be coming to mind. Like, that to me is one of those red flags that goes up when I see it, because I have expertise of how people have used confirmation bias to find fault in women in high-profile, emotionally charged cases.
Yeah. I think it's worth pausing a minute to just spell out that, one, again, it's different than prejudice, right? We're talking about cognitive bias. We're talking about a thing that afflicts all humans.
Yes.
And
we're not saying anybody's racist. That's not what this is. This is how we think about reality and how our previous instruction and experience sort of works as a filter through which you recognize things in nature and recognize their patterns and whether or not they are connected. And so, one of the things that is really helpful, so I think a really important thing that maybe we should talk about is, given the fact that we are all prone to bias and that we're all probably experts of something, what is it that we can actually do to try to prevent our expertise from being sort of twisted into confirmation bias?
Well,
And
this brings us to ETL Drawer, I think. I was going to bring him up
yes.
because we did an episode of Labyrinths with him quite a while ago. We can put that in the show notes too. But he's an expert in cognitive bias, specifically as it pertains to the forensic sciences. And he's done these really clever and eye-opening studies that show that fingerprint analysts and medical examiners and, blood splatter people and DNA people, like people whose job it is to look at some scientific evidence and determine whether or not it's a match, they are just as easily swayed by biasing irrelevant information as a layperson. And one of the great examples of this is like you tell a fingerprint analyst that the person confessed, and it changes whether or not they think the prints are a match, right? Even when you give them prints from their own case history where they had previously determined no match on the very same set of prints, now you give them the prints and say, oh, by the way, here's a hypothetical case, or here's a new case we're working on. The defendant confessed, by the way. Now it's a match. So hypothetically, that fingerprint expert should be totally objective, should not be swayed by that other information about whether or not these set of lines match each other, and yet they are. And so Drawer's recommendation for how to combat that is called linear sequential unmasking, which is you only give people the information that is absolutely necessary to performing their task, and don't give them any information unrelated to it. So
this is being blind wherever possible. So only presenting yourself as an expert with the information that is necessary for the question that you are asked to address. Now, that's not always possible. There are other things that you can do. For example, seeking out disconfirming evidence is another one of those things. So one of the things that is a hallmark of confirmation bias is not just the sort of cherry picking of reality to like find pieces of evidence that can, when mashed together, can sort of fit your conclusion. It's also the ignoring of exonerating evidence, for example, in the case of a wrongful conviction. And I don't think that people yes, some people intentionally ignore exonerating evidence and even suppress it and hide it. But I think a lot of the time you're just not trained to look for it. And so because we're imperfect and only have so much attention and all of the things, it's a good practice to, as you are sort of developing your theory, which you feel you're doing on the basis of evidence, to seek out if there is anything that disconfirms your theory, if there's any evidence that seems to suggest otherwise, just to make sure that you're not overlooking something. And a really important thing also to do, another thing that I think people sort of mistake, is really, because expertise sort of asks you not just to observe things, but also to observe the relationship and meaning of those things next to each other. So one thing to do as you're developing a theory about something is to take a step back and separate, like really intentionally separate what is observed and what is an interpretation. So this is when I say, like, it's really important to know the difference between a fact and an opinion. And again, like in the case of my case, the number of times I've argued with Giuliano Mignini about the fact that there's a difference between my roommate's body was covered with a blanket and only a woman would cover a body with a blanket. One of those is a fact. The other one is an opinion. However, if you're an expert, sometimes you think that your opinion should be treated as a fact. And in fact, in your own brain, it feels the same as a fact. But this is where it's really important to take a step back and go, okay, what am I observing versus how am I interpreting it? And is there another way to interpret what I am observing?
I was going to throw a sort of out of left field example at you to see how it hits you. But let's imagine you have a girlfriend who's been cheated on by 4 different, past partners. This girl is an expert on being cheated on.
Yes.
Right? And one day, she's, says, she looks at me, I guess, in this scenario.
Okay, so I'm the cheated on woman.
Yeah.
And you're the potential cheater.
Well, she just says something like, I recognize a cheater when I see one, right? And it's like, maybe let's go back in time. Maybe you're dating someone and, this is your new boyfriend you bring to your friend. And she's like, I don't know. I recognize a cheater when I see one, the way he looked at that other girl at the barbecue, whatever it is. How do you, is that friend biased by her experience? Does she have real expertise in that field? How do you know the difference? How does she know the difference?
So the closest thing that I can compare this to is when, and I write about this in my book, Free My Search for Meaning, when I made the mistake of trusting and getting in a relationship with a person who said that he was a wrongly convicted person, but was in fact a guilty person and a con man. And I didn't listen to other people around me who were saying, I don't know, there's something off about this guy. And I attributed their feelings about him to who knows what. Like, I was just like, I just didn't understand. And no one could really explain to me. No one could really cite evidence as to why they were picking up signs. But they were ultimately right. And in fact, the person I really should have listened to in that moment was my old cellmate. So my old cellmate, when she met him, she pulled me aside and was like, what she literally said was, he's a snake. Get out now. And I was just flabbergasted. But of course, here's a woman who has a lot more experience with the criminal underground than I do. And she was right.
And who had herself been a victim of
a con man.
Of a handsome con man.
Yes.
Which is why she wound up in prison.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I should have, I think, so in this specific instance of the girlfriend who's like, I don't know, he seems like a cheater to me, I would probe deeper. I would say, that's interesting. One, what could my friend's motivation be for saying that to me? Is she the kind of friend who is just trying to stir things up and be dramatic? Or is she a kind of friend who in the past has proven herself to be thoughtful and just looking out for my best interests? That's one interesting data point. Another interesting data point is to ask her about her expertise. Okay, you know what? I grant you, you're an expert in a cheating man. Tell me what all the signs are. Basically, what is the evidence? And cite me the evidence. Yeah. And is there any kind of evidence that you could be presented with that would counter your conclusion? And if she says, I don't think anything could prove that that he's a good man, then you'd be like, okay, well, it sounds like you're making the same, does God exist argument.
I mean, to bring it back to a criminal justice context, you could say that a prosecutor who spends their career as a prosecutor develops expertise in the ways in which guilty people try to claim innocence, how they try to avoid accountability, and the hallmarks through which crimes are committed and how they're covered up and all that stuff. They learn to recognize patterns. Yeah. They're an expert on guilty people claiming innocence.
Yeah.
More than anyone else could probably claim to be an expert in that. Right?
Sure.
And so if you were to ask them, well, is there anything that could sway your opinion? I think that, yeah, they would say, well, of course, if there's
they would say that,
right?
Except I would be interested to know, have you ever been wrong? Have you ever had a false positive? And what did you learn from that false positive? Like, to me, I think that everyone in the criminal justice system should be taught not just how to wield the law in order to get the outcome that you want, but to understand like the consequences of how the law is wielded and whether or not just outcomes were derived. And I think that a review of maybe not even their own work, but just other examples of how career prosecutors who did amazing things also made mistakes and how they did that. Like, one of the things that you can do, a really useful exercise for any kind of conviction that you might be bringing yourself to, is just imagine, this is an imagination exercise, that 50 years down the line, or 20 years, whatever, however many years go by, and you realize that you were wrong. Like, that's the premise of this argument. Whatever it is that you believe, be it a case or whatever, some years go down the line and you were wrong. You were wrong. Just, 100%.
Chumbawamba is not, in fact, the best band ever.
Right. Sure. Then you like try to work backwards and go, oh shit, how did I get it wrong? And you ask yourself, like, what would have been necessary for me? What information would I have needed to have noticed then, or would have gotten later on, that would have shown me that I was actually wrong? And, I think for me, as it regards the Lucy Letby case, I mean, I'm troubled that there seems to be no consensus by any medical experts as to even how these babies died. And that's deeply troubling to me. I also don't like the fact that investigating the conditions within the hospital wasn't a high enough priority for the investigation, because if there was a rise in deaths in the maternity ward, for example, which has been claimed, Lucy Letby didn't work in the maternity ward. She couldn't have had any influence in that. So is it a coincidence that at the exact same time there was also a rise in stillbirths in the maternity ward?
This is why every Mulder needs a Scully, essentially.
Every
right?
Mulder needs a Scully.
Yeah,
Where was Scully?
If you have an X-Files department staffed by 2 Mulders, then you think everything is aliens.
Right.
But you got to have someone. The only problem is in that show, Scully's always wrong, and it is something supernatural. But
it's true. It is true.
But yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the sort of systemic ways that you fix this, and you hinted at this earlier, but, currently in most criminal legal systems around the world, people spend their career in either prosecution or defense.
Yeah.
And they don't say swap back and forth. And it would be a radically different system if the person who was prosecuting a murder trial 1 month, next month was acting as a defense attorney. If you had to switch jobs every 6 months or whatever it is, so you get expertise in both sides, and so you don't become inculcated in looking at the world through a particular lens.
And also not inculcated in individual cases, because one might argue that, I think some people would push back and say, well, what, you're going to ask like some of these cases take years to investigate and prosecute. What, am I going to switch back and forth between the defense and the prosecution for an individual case, just back and forth? Like, does that make sense? And it doesn't make sense in some ways, because there are certain things that defense experts should have access to that prosecutions should not, like private communications between the client and the defense attorney. In that way, there are certain things that you can't like just switch back and forth for.
But on a single case, sure.
In a single case. But I'm saying like it would be really interesting though, even in an individual case, putting aside the like access to the client, just in terms of being tasked with evaluating the evidence. I think it would be really interesting if people were tasked with evaluating the evidence from both sides so that you didn't have this like feeling of my case is the prosecution's case. This is my case. It's not your case. It is a case, you know.
I think that that's probably unworkable as a practical solution, but it is workable to say, one, if a case goes to appeal, do not have the same prosecutor
or the same judge.
Or the same judge. Like those people have ego tied up in the conclusions they came to the first time. And they're there to defend their conclusion against some appellant who is saying, your conclusion is wrong. New people, new prosecutor, new judge, always. But also just, all-time quarterback. You've done that, I'm sure. Have you ever played like pickup soccer or football or something? It's like you don't quite have the right even teams, and so some person is just always on offense, say. And
I played on premier teams, and everyone was good.
Okay, well, when you're playing like pickup football and you don't have even numbers, like that's an easy way to solve that problem. Is just one person is always all-time quarterback or something. So whenever the other team has the ball, you're now on the other team. Right? And now you're trying to help that team win. A play later, you're now helping the other team win.
Sure.
It's not hard to do. And when you spread that out over just, instead of plays, it's cases, right? Every time you take a new case, you switch. Or even just make it every year, every 6 months or every year. It could be every 2 years. I think the thing is that you want those lawyers, prosecutors and defense attorneys to gain expertise in both sides, which will make them less likely to be biased towards seeing the world through a very particular lens of I know how to recognize guilt versus I know how to recognize innocence. And it also solves the problem of most judges are former prosecutors. And so the path to becoming a judge is becoming a prosecutor, and the prosecutors are tight with the police and they're tight with the judges. And so in any given case, the judge may have personal social ties to the prosecutor or to the cops because they all come up through that same path. And those personal social ties are a biasing factor. And that biasing factor could be countered if the judge had the same kind of social ties to the defense attorneys, right?
I wonder if what our like actual colleagues who work in the field would say about this, because I'm sure they would find fault in it in a million ways, but it seems practical. Anyway, so I think, so that's, I think, how I would respond. Actually, here's what I would do. I would not respond to that person on Twitter because I don't feel compelled to respond to every person on Twitter who likes to dismiss me and what I have to offer the world. But in terms of just this overall discussion around expertise and bias, yes, it is absolutely important to acknowledge that experts can be biased and often are biased unless they take preventative measures and are trained as part of their expertise to seek out do preventative measures to make sure that they're not just treating everything like a hammer treats everything like a nail.
Yeah, it's a combination of systemic incentive structures that helped counteract bias, and then the individual person being trained to recognize the various cognitive biases that we're all prone to so that they can try to see them in their own thinking. I want to bring this to the jury for a minute because you've been judged by many juries over the years, but you've never yourself been on a jury, and you probably never will be.
I know, it's a bummer.
Right.
Because I would be very good on a jury because of my expertise. And this is something that I know that you have a personal sort of like thing against. And I agree with you that our justice system sort of depends upon putting the most ignorant people on a jury as possible. And anything that is considered as if ignorance equals objectivity. That's where I push back. That, like, first of all, having any kind of experience with a thing suddenly means that you're not objective about it. Like, I don't think that that's
Yeah.
the case, as we have discussed here. Just because I've been wrongly convicted doesn't mean that I can't imagine that somebody might be guilty of a crime, like Dodoy. But the idea that like somebody who's never gone through the criminal justice system is therefore going to be fair and objective towards someone who is going through the criminal justice system, that to me is a very silly
it's
thing.
two flawed assumptions, right?
Yes.
It's the flawed assumption that experience equals bias and that ignorance equals objectivity.
But
Because-
you know what would actually address this issue? Because the thing that really bothers me about it is that there's no data to prove one way or the other. Like, I guess there is some data to say that, like, there has been proven through data that all white juries are, disproportionately convicting Black people versus white people because blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So there is some data on this. But I think the thing that would actually really help this whole scenario is if we did the thing here in the United States that they do in Italy, which is they make juries reveal their thought process.
Yeah.
Like, instead of treating, just sort of saying, okay, well, you have no experience with this issue and with the justice system, therefore you're going to be objective and rational. We're just going to assume that you're going to be objective and rational. Why don't we just have people write out and explain how they came to their conclusions in order for us to then retroactively look and see if that was actually objective and rational or not? Like, that's, to me, it seems like the most common sense thing that we could implement right now. There's already a practice of it.
Yeah. So
in
it's
Europe.
not just, I don't know, he feels guilty to me. Right?
You know, like,
Yeah.
and that's supposed to be good enough. Like, that's not good enough. And of course, this is not to like rag on jury members. I know a lot of people who do end up on juries take the job really seriously, and they put a lot of thought into it, and they deliberate, and they do all the things that they're supposed to. Why not have a document that proves it? That shows, here's all of the work you did to deliberate and to consider and carefully all the things.
You got to show your work on math
Show
homework.
your work. Prove your work. It's not enough to just say, here's the equation, here's the solution. You could have come up with that in a million different ways. Show your work. So I think
agree with that. Yeah. I think, even I have been booted from a jury just because I know someone who has been, accused of a crime, right?
Yeah.
Just knowing you is enough to get me off a jury. And I think the other problem is that jurors are not given any real training. They're given like 20 minutes of prep to understand complicated legal concepts like beyond a reasonable doubt or the burden of proof, which people in law school spend a long time digging into the nuances of those.
Philosophers deal with that question. Like, no, I think it all comes down to vibes is ultimately what it comes down to. And those vibes are never put in a position of having to be checked against, review because they're kept secret and sacred. And so I think it's astonishing that for such a profoundly civilized culture that has a long history of law enforcement and judicial review of all the bullshit, we still don't have this very common sense thing figured out, which is that we should be showing our work.
There's two other things I want to bring up here before we close. One is, if there's any social psychologists listening to this, it would be great if we had data, for instance, on do jury members who have been victims of violent crime, are they more likely or less likely to convict someone of a violent crime? Like, do some mock jury studies and get those outcomes. That would be super interesting. And then two is that bias is actually important in certain directions. And when you think about, say, Blackstone's ratio, that it's better that 10 guilty men go free than that one innocent person is convicted, like the integrity of the justice system depends upon not getting it wrong. right? That's more important than catching every bad guy, is what that philosophical claim is. You might disagree with that claim, but I don't. But that's the claim, is that if you want people to have faith in the justice system, it needs to get it wrong at an astonishingly low rate, right? And you could look at medical testing in the same way. Like, is it better that a test has a false positive or a false negative? Well, if you're testing for, COVID even, or cancer or something like that, I think you would much rather have a false positive than a false negative. Then you go, okay, shoot, positive, let's test again, right? Otherwise, you end up with a situation where someone who has a deadly disease. And so when it comes to bias towards things like criminal justice, even if you do have a bias towards innocence, my dear lovely wife, I think that's probably a good thing. Like, we need that. We need perspectives out there that are biased towards that, because the system is overwhelmingly biased in the opposite direction. And the integrity of the system depends upon that.
Can I just say a thing, though? I think people assume that just because I was wrongly convicted, that means that I assume, like, it's really interesting to me that people assume that I assume that anyone who claims they are innocent is innocent. And that is not the case.
Oh, people also assume that you're defund the police and that you're,
people assume a lot of things about me that are not true. You know who also claimed innocence? The guy who actually murdered my roommate and blamed me. So I'm perfectly aware that there are a lot of guilty people who claim to be innocent. And you know what? That pisses me the fuck off. So anything, there is more depth and nuance to my perspective than said Twitter hater.
It also just occurred to me that, you lived alongside actual criminals for many years. You also have expertise in criminals,
Much more than, I assume much more than that guy.
Yeah.
Anyway, so.
All right, well, there you have it. Expertise and bias.
I think I did a lot of swearing in this one.
Yeah. So check the show notes if you want to read Amanda's Atlantic essay about the Jens Suring case, or check out our former episode with cognitive scientist ETL Drawer. And you can also, we'll put a link to the Lucy Letby Doubt podcast, which is currently rolling out through iHeartRadio. And thanks for tuning in.
Ciao, everyone. Mwah.